Hello, everybody, and thank you so much for participating at this virtual roundtable on ethnic diversity in international arbitration. I'll start by introducing the four of you, very brief introductions, despite your very distinguished backgrounds, and but just briefly introduce you so that we can jump right into the topic. So first of all, Aisha Nadar, who is a procurement consultant, arbitrator, adjudicator, and mediator, Egyptian, American, and Swedish, and an electrical engineer by background. Aisha began her career in the defense sector in the US and the US Air Force, and currently focuses on construction and engineering disputes, and also some defense-related disputes. I then have with me today Harry Matovu QC, who is a leading silk in commercial and arbitration law, including in Africa-related disputes, and is at Brook Court Chambers. He is of Ugandan origin and the founder of the Charter for Black Talent in Finance and the Professions. I have Christine Batruch, a strategic sustainability advisor at Lundin Group. Lundin Group is a group of companies that specialize in mining, oil and gas, and renewables. Of Ukrainian origin, born in Canada and raised in Switzerland, and a historian and lawyer by background. She's dedicated her career to environmental, social, and governmental issues before awareness of ESG and ESG-related issues became commonplace. And last but definitely not least, Joseph Otoo, who is Senior Legal Counsel at Arup, a global design and engineering organization, and he was previously at the construction and engineering and international arbitration practices at Mayer Brown. So, having spoken with all of you separately about this topic, if we were to start talking about the approach one can take to diversity, there were among the four of you two different schools of thought. One slightly more keen towards organic growth, and another that had a call for more affirmative action. And maybe, Joseph, if I could start with you. I know that you've said to me that on this issue of diversity and promoting ethnic diversity in particular, you considered that there were no sidelines and that strong action was needed. So maybe you would like to share your thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think the challenge really is some people think that diversity doesn't actually apply to them. It's almost a minority sport for many, and I think that's counterintuitive, but also it doesn't help to resolve the problem. It's a global problem, industry problem, societal problem, and everybody needs to be in a position where they can contribute to it. And so, in a very real sense, I think it's not something you can be neutral on. You can sit on the sidelines and say, well, it doesn't actually really impact us. It impacts others, and we'll contribute as and when we think it's convenient for us to do so. Everybody needs to be pulling in the same direction, and that really means that there's no sides. There's no sides to this. There's no safe harbor, because it infiltrates and affects everybody and society in lots of different ways. So that was really the point I wanted to get across. Really, everybody needs to be pulling for this. Anybody you ask will say diversity is a good thing. It's a little bit like world peace. No one's going to be against it. When you start asking about how it's going to work, how to implement it, how to ensure that diversity actually works, then it becomes a completely different issue, and it's a challenge, and it's a challenge for everybody.
I agree. I agree with what Joseph's saying. If I can jump in here before the others shoot me down, I completely agree with what Joseph's saying. Joseph, you were looking at it from a sort of general societal point of view, and I think that you're absolutely right. Diversity is not a slogan now. It's an absolute fundamental of corporate values across many sectors and across many jurisdictions. But I wanted to look at it and see what you all think of looking at it from a very much arbitration sectoral point of view. Because it seems to me that international arbitration demands diverse pools of arbitrators. And it's a complete contradiction to have international arbitration with a non-diverse pool. And if we don't move hard to increase the diversity within the pool of arbitrators who decide international disputes, the parties who come to international arbitration will simply lose confidence in the system. And you see this has happened with investment treaty arbitration. And in that sphere, it's particularly states who are concerned about this. They're walking away from the ICSID regime and other regimes because they do not see panels which might have a conspectus and a perspective to address disputes in which they are involved with sufficient diversity of thought. And we all know how narrow the pool of regular arbitrators in that sphere is. So it does seem to me that international arbitration demands diversity, and therefore we should push for it. But I don't know what others think. That's where I am.
I'll jump in if I may briefly. I don't disagree with you that it demands diversity, but given party autonomy, can you get? Do you then have? Are the parties that expect diversity also responsible to participate in the creation of the roster of a diverse panel? I mean, using the example of ICSID, every country that is a member state, as a signatory to the Washington Convention, has an opportunity to put forward their lists, their arbitrators on the panel for a period of 4 to 6 years, and their conciliators. So the requirement is there, but how do we get to that diverse panel of countries that are expecting diversity? And I'm maybe playing a devil's advocate just to...
No, I think you ask a very acute question. Party autonomy is the limit beyond which we cannot go. But I suppose it depends what we mean by organic growth and what we mean by affirmative action. And if you're an institution, you can make it central to your mission to promote diversity, even if parties in a particular dispute say, we don't want to go with a new arbitrator, we want to go with what we know. I mean, what do you think, Christine?
Well, I'll bring it back to the corporate world, which I know better than the arbitration sector. And I look at, the evolution in the past 20 years over those issues. And the company I worked for had like 26 nationalities, over 40 people at corporate. I'm not talking about the rest of the world. So it was a given. And yet, you see certain unconscious biases taking place. And here I'll talk less about my Ukrainian background than the fact that I was a woman, that you find that people usually choose people like themselves. There's this kind of natural inclination for a man to choose a man, for a woman to choose a woman, and so forth. And therefore, over the years, we found in the company that it might be good to set up a policy on diversity, just to turn people's attention to unconscious biases. and make them ponder over it. So we didn't introduce a requirement, i.e. you have to have 50% women or 80% ethnic diversity, but there was the point of being aware of how that might actually enhance company performance. So if you go back to the discussion between organic growth and affirmative action, I think it varies both in time and also in terms of the experience. I worked in Norway for a while, where they introduced a requirement of women on boards, and it made a huge difference. You know, the pro side was, yes, women started appearing in boards and in senior management positions, and people realizing that it could actually be a plus. But then it has the other side, and I'm sure all of you have experienced it because we're all of different ethnic backgrounds, of the notion, well, she got in because of the quota. So there also has to be an element of a process leading to more diversity, as opposed to an imposition of quota, which can have a negative effect long term.
Isn't there a difference between a quota and a target? I agree with you that you don't want to impose a quota, but if you aspire to a target and say we've got to have X%, we should aspire to X% diverse arbitrators in a particular field, that would lessen the stigma that might arise.
I think sorry, Christine.
Go ahead, Joseph.
Yeah, I mean, I think on that point, Harry, it lets people off the hook, a target, and I think we need to be deliberate, and we need to be interventionist now. Now, you know, the phrase affirmative action, it came out of the US, and it came out of very specific historical contexts. So we'll have to have a look at the terminology. But why don't we challenge the corporate world? Why don't we challenge the arbitration community? And why don't we say, this is what we expect? This, whether you use a quota, by this date, this ought to happen. And there needs to be powerful, justifiable reasons why it hasn't happened. And people need to, you know, quite frankly, get off the butt and start doing something about this. But the other point I'd like to just raise very, very quickly before I let everybody else come in is, Christian, you mentioned unconscious bias, and you know, over the years, I'm having more and more problem with that term. It's not your term, of course, but it suggests that it's nobody's fault. It holds no one to account, because it's all automatic and conscious, and it's not deliberate, and people don't look at it in a deliberate way, but the effect is quite marked in terms of the result. So I think what we need to do is move away from that term.
If I may just respond to that, the term unconscious bias for me is very useful, because most people, as we started off the discussion, everybody's for diversity. Well, actually not. You know, you have the right-wing yahoos who aren't. You know, hopefully few will express it, but you know, there are people who have conscious biases. The problem is the unconscious, the people who think they don't have a bias, and we did it via a test. Right? You can there are all kinds of internet tests that you can do, and suddenly you realize you're a minority for whatever reason, whether ethnic, religious, gender, whatever, and you realize yourself you have biases. So I'm not sure. So maybe the term like affirmative action, that has a lot of connotations, both positive and negative. So you know, I wouldn't hold to the word, but I would hold to the concept that actually the ones that we want to really impact on are those who don't believe they have biases and yet have biased behaviors when they make a decision to pick somebody just like them, as opposed to pick somebody who might reflect a different opinion, a different viewpoint on any issue.
I fully agree that we all, as human beings, are more comfortable with the conventional wisdom, with people that are similar to us, have a similar thinking. In fact, when we hear somebody expressing a view that we might hold, we find them to be quite smart because they're saying the right thing. So getting out of that framework of the conventional wisdom, the comfortable choice, takes a push. And that push, I would agree with Joseph, is somehow a mandate. When you tell people this is what your aspirations should be, look at where we are with climate change. I mean, we've all had targets and aspirations and, having a nice, happy kumbaya, but yet we are killing the environment. I mean, with a layman's approach. So I think targets have failed in other ways, in other industries, and I think unless you mandate and set a framework that necessitates and pushes and drives change, you're not going to get there. And including me, I don't change unless I'm somehow forced to.
But it depends how challenging a target is, doesn't it? I mean, targets have worked very well in promoting gender diversity in the corporate world. They've worked brilliantly in the UK. But just responding on to Joseph and Chrissy, well, to all your points on unconscious bias, I'm intrigued by this discussion because it does seem to me that in a few years' time, maybe just 1 year's time, perhaps, we will stop talking about unconscious bias because the conversations that we are all having about diversity every day will mean that you don't get a free pass. It's not an option to say, I was unconscious. Where have you been in the conversation? What you're doing now is conscious. So maybe in a year's time, it'll just disappear. Here's hoping anyway.
I was related to what you're all discussing now is this perception of diversity as a risk, and as it somehow you have the choice between excellence or diversity. And I'd be really interested in hearing your views on that, because it seems that is one of the things that need to be tackled first. This thing like choosing the diverse option is somehow like risking it or taking a chance on something.
Well, if I may step in, it's definitely an opportunity, and I think that what's happening, and it shows in all of the studies that diverse companies perform much better than non-diverse companies. Integrating these ESG components, and companies show their performance over time much superior. So I think that it's certainly not a trade-off. You're not trading off quality for an aspiration. And putting ourselves in the context of arbitration most of the time is going to be between very diverse point of views, and therefore if you don't integrate that in the analysis, you're losing out on something. So I think that diversity is and ought to be a plus in this context. The question that we were discussing is more the mechanics of how to promote that, but showing numbers and indicators in other sectors in terms of how diverse institutions, and you can look at governments, you can look at what happened during COVID time, and you found out, for instance, that countries that had women leaders performed better than other countries, just because there's a different angle that may be put through. Not automatically. I'm not saying all women are, all men are, because that would be simplistic, but the diversity of the thinking is what makes society better, a company better, a family better. So it is a plus, not a minus, and shouldn't be seen as a trade-off, but may be perceived by those who were there until now and in their little club of gentlemen it might be a bit of a threat. Like anytime you're trying to change society, those who had the privileges before don't want to give them up. But then should we be concerned about that, or should we be concerned in the quality of the service that as arbitrators we're going to be providing?
Yeah. I just think the idea that it's diversity or excellence is not just silly in general life, it is just crazy in international arbitration. In international arbitration, diversity is excellence. Take, for example, a case where you've got two parties from different jurisdictions who are arguing about an issue of fraud. If the tribunal is made up just of, let us say, middle-class, middle-aged white males from one jurisdiction, they're going to have a particular view of practice of commercial life, which will dictate whether or not they decide that there was fraud in that case or whether there was not. If you take an African professional from another jurisdiction and she's on the tribunal, she may be able to inform her colleagues on the tribunal that actually what they see as potentially fraudulent or negligent activity was anything but, because the way things work in that particular jurisdiction is very different. That is why, one reason why, it seems to me, diversity has to be ingrained and embedded in arbitral tribunals dealing with international arbitration. It is excellence.
I really like that, Harry, and I completely agree. There have been studies which always say that diverse teams are more uncomfortable. It's harder, but the result, the product is always better. But just in arbitration, I think you're exactly right. But I think arbitration, as because of its international, it is an international trade, and it has a supply chain. So it doesn't start and stop with the arbitrators. It starts with everybody, the whole supply chain. So you have, you've got law firms, you've got experts, you've got this ecosystem that fuels this international trade of services. And that's also where we need to look at when we're looking at diversity, because they will contribute to that final excellence. The sifting of the evidence, the talking to witnesses, the understanding what's going on the ground will really inform the end result, and that's where we need a diversity as well. And when you look at the arbitration teams, and the associates, that it's anything but diverse. I mean, I recall being in Rwanda at a conference and speaking to an attorney general of a particular African country, and he was engaged at a law firm in London to represent them in arbitration, and he was talking with another local lawyer, and he said they had a team of 15 associates on this case, and not one of them had ever, this was an African focus case, not one of them had ever been to Africa. There was no Africans in the team. And it was not diverse at all, and that's an issue as well. That's a real challenge, and that's where we need to be looking as well.
And it's Aisha's problem of party autonomy again, it seems to me, Aisha.
Yeah, it is party autonomy, because the criteria of selection of representation, should the criteria have been placed on the law firm to have a diverse team, if you're going to represent our state in this arbitration, we require your team to look like this or possess these characteristics. So that question is there, but also then taking back to Harry's example of the diverse arbitration panel that includes two white middle-aged men from the middle class somewhere in a particular jurisdiction, and the African woman that has joined the panel, and now we have an apparently diverse panel. We need to empower her to speak up and share that diverse aspect in her thought. And we also need to work on training them on how to listen and how to accept this input and not sideline that new individual. Because I know in my career over the 40 years, when you are I've one woman at the table, sometimes the group of men think it's for another reason other than that you have anything to add, and they start by asking for coffee, or I'm showing my age, because it wasn't so far. It was that did happen to me. Somebody asked me to make the coffee and asked me to type stuff and all sorts of things that happened as an engineer working for the U.S. Air Force. But you need to train the old crowd on how to receive this new information and how to interact such that we don't sideline the new diverse people and allow this better product to flourish.
Well,
and so, sorry, go ahead.
It comes back to what you've just said, Aisha, what I've experienced in my life, that we're considered either as no good, or if against all presumptions we are actually quite good, we're nevertheless still considered to be a bit of a risk.
Or an exception to the pool. I mean, and so you need to train the old cadre as well to bring them along. And it isn't an easy nut to crack, because I think, going back to arbitration, I think institutions are doing a lot when we have the pledge and diversity, or to add women to the panel that has been signed by many institutions. I heard as recently as earlier this week regarding institutions always having a woman on the panel. The ICC has a new task force having diversity, not just ethnicity and not just gender, but looking at disabilities and having the broad scale of the broad topic of diversity addressed. So institutions are thinking about this, but I take it back to party autonomy and the other players in this arbitration microcosm or universe. How is it that we all work together to get to this product? Because at the end of the day, the parties go to arbitration to win their case.
Yeah.
And so I put that on the table. I'm not saying I have answers.
So that's why Joseph's Attorney General went to the big firm in London or wherever it was. Sorry, Christine.
No, but part of it is, I mean, I think you mentioned it before, is education and examples, case studies. Again, in my company, you convince people by results, right? You convince people by showing them the different things. So, if you have 2 or 3 flagship arbitrations that, have proceeded in a better way, obtaining a fairer result or whatever, that can demonstrate the case for arbitration, then it should be widely circulated in the various law firms and others that actually partake in that. Because I find that most of the time, and back to our unconscious bias, people revert to what they know. But if they know something better, they will move for that approach. But we have to show them there's something better.
Yeah.
I think, and this circles back to, do we do it by mandate, or do we do it by targets, or do we just let people kind of all of a sudden think of something better? And I take the example of the World Bank. They're working on I was working on a task force established by the president of the World Bank to look at ways to help prevent gender-based violence on World Bank construction funded constructions around the world. And they're deploying a mechanism that was just launched this January, or sometime around January, using dispute boards in the prevention of gender-based violence. The bank took a look. I used to be a member of the FIDIC board, and one of two women in 113 years. That's another story. Diversity in engineering. But the bank took a look at the roster of dispute board members on the FIDIC president's list and said, we need people that represent and look like our borrowers. We need a diverse panel. When the bank said that, the people listened, because we do, in a commercial world, follow the money. And if that's the funding agency and they're wanting a diverse panel, mandating a diverse panel, well, by golly, we're going to have diversity on the panel. And then you have an opportunity for that panel to do well. And then you have a story, a success story to demonstrate having a diverse panel. And then people will, but that first step needs either a push plus education plus collaboration plus all those things. I just, maybe I'm cynical. I just don't think it happens organically.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think education is key. Education as didactic as you like, and I still haven't found or come across any answer, credible answer, to the point we were discussing earlier, my example of a tribunal which has to address an issue of fraud in a multi-jurisdictional dispute. If it's all done by white men in London, for example, at some stage, people are going to question whether that is sufficient justice in the modern age. It was okay in 20 years ago. Is it okay now? And I think that the cognitive benefits, or however Leonor introduced this session, the cognitive benefits of diversity are absolutely clear cut. I haven't come across an answer to that.
I agree. I agree, and I think, Aisha, your point about being a cynic, you know, it's a realist view, and I think in a commercial world, the thing that's going to make people sit up and take the most notice is when the bottom line is being impacted, because the people will start to make decisions, and it is cynical, and it's going to take a mix of targets, quotas, however you want to call it, policy, training. But I think that the cold calculus is going to be, you know, can you be in a position where you can take either explore, take advantage, or benefit from this new reality, and the firms and the arbitrators and the institutions that do, in the long run, will win out, I think. And, you know, London law firms and globally really are missing a trick. If you had a very deep and wide arbitration practice, which, you know, had exchange schemes with different law firms, had a really good mix of different ethnicities and genders, if you could get that to work, you would be a market leader in no time. And, you know, so it's there.
Could I ask you all for your views on a slightly different angle to this? So another challenge to the promotion of diversity is the danger of assimilation. Of if you have a very simplistic example, but if you have a 3-member tribunal and there is one diverse person among the other two, and there can be that risk of the odd one out, so to speak, to just want to not rock the boat and just fit right in. And I would be very interested to have your views on that. I know that, for example, Christine you talked about modular diversity and how you found that worked in your career, and I found that a very interesting point of view.
Well, I think it's a natural tendency to want to fit in, and I think that's everybody's first inclination. So I remember when I started working, I was wearing suits and everything to look like, my colleagues. And after a while, I became affirmative about who I was and affirmative about being different. In any case, I was different because I was working in sustainability in an oil and gas company. Everybody was treasure hunting and looking for the money. And I was saying, but how do we do it? It's just as important. So it became almost one of these advocacy things for me to actually voice that different voice. And I was very lucky that where I worked, they were actually willing to have that different voice and integrating that different voice in their decision making. Now, of course, it's a process and it takes time. So, there was a process within me that first I wanted to act like them, be like them, and then realized, no, this is not my role. My role is actually to bring that different perspective and to own, what I'm promoting. So, again, it depends in the context in which you're finding yourself, because if you find yourself in a context where the two others, want you to conform, it might be a little bit harder. But, remembering that part of the role of an outsider is to bring the outsider viewpoint, I think is the way to actually proceed.
Christine, what's modular diversity?
Modular diversity in the sense of that you pick and choose when and how you express what makes you diverse from one point of view or another, and that according to the situation, I found myself using that in very different ways in different contexts. You have to know your audience. So again, part of my reticence about quotas and things like that is, and we see it right now, there's a backlash when we're doing the right things. There's a backlash from those who had the privilege before, right? And so it's also a question of balancing. So, for me, but that's what makes us richer, because we're, when we have a diverse background, we know that we have to play different tunes differently to be audible to whoever we want. And so, if you're aware and conscious of your role and the goal that you want to fulfill, then the path that you may follow may be modular.
I see. That puts quite a lot of onus on the minority member, doesn't it?
Well, you know something, Harry? My dad, we were immigrants from Egypt. We immigrated to Nebraska when I was just about to turn 5. And my dad kind of, he passed away 6 years ago. So he told each one of us, my 3 older brothers and me, when Nebraska in 1969 looked awful white, Germanic and Czech, and we were the diversity in the little box. He said, "You will never be equal, but you can always be better." And then demand what you want. And that lesson is a little bit what Christine is saying. You really do have to do your homework. And there is a lot of onus on the diverse member because you are a bit rocking the boat. But as I grew up, I found that I had a choice as a person. I traveled a lot in my life because of my father's job since then. And looking back and connecting the dots backwards, I found that I had a choice to either feel like I'm an immigrant, an outsider, or that I'm an expat. I'm there to impart my knowledge and to share my knowledge. And I've done my homework. I've studied, I've worked, I don't have all the experience in the world, but I have a certain package that I bring to a table that I sit at. And if I'm part of a panel, if I'm appointed by the party, I play a different role than if I'm president of an ICC tribunal, and that onus is on me. To borrow Christine's term of modular diversity, I've got to, use my package and play my role in the way that I'm going to be most effective for.
So what about the majority? We're not giving them a free pass, are we? We're saying that they have to be educated. Yeah. And when they do find a minority member on their panel, they've got to sit up and pay attention. Yeah, it seems to me.
Yeah, that's a really good point. The onus, and this goes back to my point right at the beginning. It's not going to be, and it can't be a spectator sport. If those people from a diverse background are in that context, and they're looking to input and contribute to change, those people in the majority also have that responsibility, and that's key, I think.
I can't help but reflect when you use that word, those who are in the majority, Joseph. When we're talking about international arbitration, it's actually those who display the diverse characteristics who are the majority in the global. They're the global majority. Yeah. It's just the irony of this whole discussion is brought out by this particular question.
The users,
yes,
in the majority. That those service providers do need to work on this as well.
Mm. Yeah. I think the discussion is, because it has many layers. In the tribunal, if we talk about the majority in the tribunal, I'm a diversity in a box one more time. I'm an engineer by training, and I'm a woman, and I'm, so, and I usually sit with leading silks who probably don't think I need have a space at the table or should deserve a space at the table, but I have a different view, and we after a year or two we come to understand each other better. It will take time to so when we talk about, when Joseph says majority, I think of majority on the tribunal, not majority in international commercial arbitration around the table. Then the majority is diverse, because international commercial arbitration is the 160 nations, and they don't look the same as people that represent a certain tranche of society. So
I'd like to go back also to the example, we were talking about assimilation, but the success cases. I go back to my little professional experience. I was the first woman manager and the first woman VP in the company. At the time, there were only women secretaries. When I left, it was like 30 or 40% women in the company. So it's also that first diverse candidate, whether it's in a tribunal or what, carries an onus, heavier than their normal one. But the fact is that it actually impacts others, because once they see, oh yes, that person actually can bring something additional, and we usually do, just by the fact that we've had to fight a little bit harder than others, right? So then we open up this whole momentum. And I know in my company a lot of women would come to me and say, oh well, we can believe in a career because you had one, so and again, whether it's ethnic, gender, or whatever, the fact is we need a few of those cases to prove the case, which unfortunately we shouldn't, but this is the reality of the world we live in.
But listening to the three of you and your fascinating views leads me to think part of the education that we all agree should be given to those who are in the positions of privilege at the moment should be to flip the argument to say, actually, when Aisha joins you on your tribunals and you think she's in the minority, you've got to start looking at the world in a completely different way because you are the minority in international arbitration. So there's a new program now, you've got to get with it, and your whole way of being has got to change. And I think that's the education we must give people.
It's a great point, and I think those arbitrators who are up for it will rise to the challenge, and they'll do it, and the law firms will, and those dinosaurs who think that it's business as usual will hopefully retire.
Well, I mean, I have to say that I'm married to one of those dinosaurs, so you know, I kind of work, or kind of my life is it, and I think if you push too hard, don't be surprised, you know, that you get pushback.
Yeah.
So I'm a little bit with Christine as saying you need to have your tools and know when to use them and know how hard to push. Because oftentimes when you hold a contractor's feet to the fire for too long, you just get burnt feet and you don't get a measure of success. So, but I'm really intrigued by what Leonor has mentioned, Harry, about the Black talent. And I think that education part and giving forward and empowering the new generation to be at the table and to succeed at the table and not to assimilate and be proud of your differences. So I'd like to hear more about that, Harry.
Well, very happy to talk about that and to compare it with the journey that you and Christine in particular have had on the gender bias issues. I'm not a D&I expert. I'm just a hack lawyer trying to make a living, but I've got my own experiences of being seen as a risk. Do we give this big high-profile brief to this guy, or maybe not? So I've got that experience, and I'm sure you all have. What I'm finding is that in my discussions, as you've said, Aisha, a lot of particularly the young Black professionals come out of university bristling with qualifications, very able people, but they have, or they are given after a while, a certain inferiority complex because they're not being promoted, they're being overlooked, they're not being given the big assignments. And that whole piece of education about showing, must be about showing them that they are as good as their qualifications say that they are, and better. I loved your father's quote, Aisha. I'm going to treasure that. You won't be equal, you can be better. And that they are. And also teaching those in leadership, current leadership, who have the role of deciding whether or not to promote them, that actually you've got within your organizations some pretty damn good people there who have got parents who told them that they are not equal, but actually better, who've got the aspiration, who've got the resilience and all of that. And I'm very excited from the discussions I've been having on the initiative that I'm pursuing by seeing that I'm not just whistling into the wind. There are people out there who hear and who can rise to that challenge. There is a huge amount of quality out there which isn't being used. And it's just so self-defeating when this diverse talent is not used. It's crime.
I agree. I mean, Harry, I've seen, you know, the profile of the organization you've built up, and you've done a really excellent job. And there's lots of people who are really behind you on this. But just Aisha, just to pick up my point, I maybe I sound a little bit you know, too revolutionary in what I'm demanding, but I think, you know, I've been having this conversation about diversity since I was in law school, you know, 15 years ago, and everybody decided that, you know, slowly it will change, and I'm still having this conversation. So you'll excuse me if I'm thinking, well, actually, like, a politician gets voted out because he's not doing his job. You know, people need to take responsibility and have accountability. And if they're not part of it, and I don't want to be stark here, but I think it's, if you're not part of the you're either part of the solution or you're part of the problem, and that will, you know, make people very uncomfortable with you know, this stark black and white, and it's never black and white. It's always grey or shades of grey. But I think we need to start pushing a little bit harder and start giving people who are in those leadership positions a little bit more pressure to contribute to, it's not all on their shoulders, to contribute to change.
I have to say, I think that if not my generation, certainly Joseph's generation and the generation below, they're the people who are going to drive this. And those who are currently in leadership wanting to recruit young talent to their organizations, we realize that if they're not with the conversation of the young people, they're just not going to join their organizations. And I think that's going to be a real driver,
I fully agree with you both, and Joseph, I like rocking the boat. I really appreciate because you have to have passion to create change, and you obviously have that passion. But I just think we need to bring, through this education, also bring the users around to a different thought. Bring that attorney general that you met in Rwanda, bring him around to know that there are law firms that can win his case that have a diverse pool of associates. And he doesn't have to be disappointed and choose excellence versus people that he would feel more comfortable representing him. And so I think we just need to, and that education may take similar passion, but more of gentle nudging than a fierce push. Just a suggestion on the table, that's all.
I mean, just on that point, I think we've got to be realistic that Attorney General should understand that the quality within his country of lawyer who could take on that case is going to be smaller in size than what you could get on Wall Street or in the City of London. But he's got to look for it. And the problem is the users are not looking for it on their doorstep. They're just rushing to the big global firms to do all the work, and they're not expanding the pool.
And so, yeah, I mean, I think that goes back to the full circle of having the universe or all the participants in this universe of arbitration, not just the institutions, not just the law firms, but the users. And back to ICSID, circling back to Harry's first comment about the ICSID panel, they've got to, when Egypt or Sweden or the US, those are my three home countries, when they're considering who they're going to put on that ICSID panel, I haven't been put on there by Egypt or the US. I was put on there by Sweden. I mean, as a conciliator. But so the countries have to think of it.
Yeah. And
we might have a role to play in helping them think of it and showcasing to them. Showcasing to Uganda that they have, maybe you are on the ICSID panel for Uganda, so if you are, I apologize, but they should have you on their ICSID panel, or at the UK.
And if you've got a case which is bet the company case, make or break case, then it may be that as a user you say, look, I want to go to one of the big global firms, but then you get, as was it you or Christine, I can't remember, who said earlier on in our discussion, you should say to them, I want your team, but I want you to have seconded to your team somebody from this other jurisdiction who's not just going to be learning, but who's going to be making a contribution. Maybe that's the way to do it.
And they're going to say yes. That big white shoe law firm is never going to turn away the business. Yes.
Follow the money, as you say.
Sorry, I'm back to mine.
Thank you so much. Is there anything else you would like to say for the webinar's sake?
Well, not for that, just to thank you, Leonor, for introducing me to, I know Joseph, but the Aisha and Christine. I've been fascinated to hear your views. I've really enjoyed it.
Yeah.
So thank you.